Please. Not here, the little girl whispered, her voice barely audible as she glanced nervously toward the cafeteria entrance. Daniel Whitmore stopped where he was. Why not here? He asked softly, careful not to raise his voice. Did I come to the wrong place? Annie shook her head quickly, her small hands tightening around something she had tucked behind her back. No, but you shouldn't stand here, she said, almost pleading now. If they see you, they'll see me. Daniel's eyes softened, but he didn't move away. See you doing what? He asked gently. For a second, Annie hesitated. Then she shifted slightly, trying to block his view with her shoulder, pressing whatever she held tighter against her back. It's nothing, she murmured. Please, just go back. Daniel tilted his head just a little. Not confronting, just observing. I already saw it, he said quietly. That made her freeze. Her fingers curled tighter. You saw? She whispered. Daniel lowered himself slowly, one knee touching the tile so he wouldn't tower over her. I saw you hiding something, he said, his tone calm, almost reassuring. Food, right? Annie's eyes flickered up to his for half a second wide, uncertain before dropping again. She didn't deny it this time. Instead, she pulled the small bundle around to her front, still holding it close to her chest, like it was something fragile, or something that could be taken away at any moment. I'm not stealing, she said quickly, the words rushing out. I didn't take extra. Her voice trailed off. Daniel didn't interrupt. He kept his hands open, resting loosely on his knee. I didn't say you were stealing, he replied. That slowed her down. The tension in her shoulders eased just slightly. Daniel nodded toward the napkin in her hands. Can I ask you something? He said. She hesitated, then gave the smallest nod. Why are you hiding it? He asked. What are you saving the food for? Annie looked down at the napkin, carefully pressing the folded edge flat again, as if making it neater would somehow make it safer. For a moment, she didn't answer. Finally, she spoke. I need to take it home, she said quietly. Daniel's voice stayed gentle. For later? He asked. Annie shook her head. No. A small pause. For my mom. Daniel didn't move. Your mom's at home? He asked. Annie nodded. She's trying to find a new job, she said. She says she's not hungry. Her fingers tightened around the napkin again. But she is, she added softly. Daniel felt something shift in his chest. He glanced briefly toward the cafeteria again. Everything looked normal from there. Kids eating, teachers talking. Then he looked back at Annie. And you? He asked quietly. Are you hungry? Annie gave a small shrug, like the question didn't matter very much. I eat enough, she said. I don't need all of it. The simplicity of it made it harder to hear. Daniel exhaled slowly, his gaze steady on her. So you eat less, he said, more to himself than to her. So your mom can eat more. Annie didn't respond. She just adjusted the napkin again, folding it tighter, protecting what little was inside. Daniel noticed how careful she was with it, how deliberate, like it wasn't just food. He leaned back slightly, giving her space again. You thought I was going to tell someone, he said. Annie didn't look up. If they see me, she whispered, they'll say I'm not allowed. And then what happens? Daniel asked. She swallowed. I won't get to take anything home anymore. Fear of losing the only way she knew how to help. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, though his voice remained calm. That's why you asked me not to stand here, he said. Annie nodded. You're not supposed to be here, she repeated quietly. People don't come back here. Daniel glanced around again. She was right. This wasn't a place meant to be seen. Then he looked back at her, really looked this time, at the way she sat on the floor instead of at a table, at the way she kept herself small. I'm glad I did come here, he said softly. Annie blinked, surprised. Daniel gave a small, reassuring nod. You're not in trouble with me, he added, and I'm not going to take that from you. Her grip loosened slightly. Daniel shifted slightly, resting his weight more comfortably against his knee. The tile floor was colder than he expected. Do you always sit here? He asked after a moment. Annie hesitated. Her eyes flicked toward the opening again, then back down. I'm supposed to stay out of the way, she said quietly. There were dozens of empty seats just beyond the divider. He had seen them when he walked in, tables half filled, chairs pushed in neatly. space that no one seemed in a hurry to claim. "And this is out of the way?" he asked. Annie gave a small nod. "It's easier," she said. "Easier for who?" Daniel didn't ask that out loud. Instead, he glanced around the corner more carefully this time, letting his eyes adjust to what he hadn't been meant to notice at first. A stack of spare chairs leaned against the wall, untouched. A cart with cleaning supplies stood nearby, its wheels locked in place like it hadn't moved all day. The trash can positioned just close enough wasn't overflowing, but it was present in a way that felt intentional. His gaze returned to Annie. She had opened her lunchbox now, moving slowly, carefully, as if each motion had to be considered before it was made. Inside, there was a small sandwich, a carton of milk, and a few apple slices in a plastic bag. She picked up one slice, then set it back down. Daniel watched without interrupting. Instead, she reached for the sandwich again, broke off a small piece, and ate it with quiet precision. No crumbs, no wasted movement. Everything about her felt measured. "You don't have to rush," Daniel said gently. Annie shook her head. "I'm not rushing," but she was, not in speed and intention. Every bite seemed calculated, as if she were keeping track of something only she could see. Daniel leaned back slightly, resting one hand on the floor beside him. "Does anyone know you do this?" he asked. Annie's head snapped up just a fraction. "No," she said quickly. Then, softer, "They're not supposed to." Daniel nodded once. "I won't tell them," he said. That earned him a longer look, not full trust, but curiosity. "Why?" she asked. It was the first question she had asked him. Daniel considered it for a moment. "Because you're not doing anything wrong," he said simply. Annie studied him, as if weighing whether that answer made sense in her world. Then she looked down again. "They say we're not allowed to take food out," she murmured. "Who says that?" She shrugged. "Just the rules." "The rules." Daniel exhaled slowly. He watched as Annie folded the rest of her sandwich back into the napkin, tucking it carefully into the side pocket of her lunchbox. Then she closed the lid halfway. Not all the way, just enough to keep it hidden, but still accessible. "Do you always save part of it?" he asked. Annie nodded. "Sometimes more," she said. "Why more?" She hesitated. Then, if she didn't eat the night before, if this moment touched your heart, take a second to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and tell us where you are watching from. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more. Daniel felt that one land deeper than the rest. He looked away for a second, his gaze drifting toward the cafeteria again. Daniel turned back. "And your mom," he said carefully, "she knows you do this?" Annie shook her head. "No." "Why not?" "Because she'd say no," Annie replied. "She'd say I should eat it." A small pause. "But she says that even when she's hungry." There was no accusation in her voice, just certainty. Daniel felt his throat tighten slightly, though his expression remained steady. "You're trying to help her," he said. Annie didn't answer. She just picked up another small piece of the sandwich and ate it slowly. That was what she called it, even without saying the word. Daniel glanced again at the divider, at the space between this corner and the rest of the cafeteria. It wasn't far, a few steps at most, but it might as well have been a different world. "Annie," he said after a moment, "what happens if someone sees you take it?" Her hands stilled. For the first time since he had met her, there was something else in her expression. "They'll tell me to put it back," she said quietly. "And if you don't?" She didn't answer right away. "Then, I don't want to find out." Daniel nodded slowly. That was enough. He shifted his weight and stood up, not abruptly, not drawing attention, just a smooth, quiet movement back to his full height. Annie looked up at him, her eyes following the motion. For a second, something flickered there again. Worry. "Are you going to go?" she asked. Daniel paused. He looked down at Annie, at the lunchbox in her lap, at the careful way she held it like it mattered more than anything else in that moment. Then he shook his head. "Not yet," he said. Annie blinked. Daniel offered a small, reassuring smile. "I think I want to understand this place a little better first." She didn't fully understand what he meant, but she didn't need to, because for the first time, someone had seen what she was doing. And instead of stopping her, he had stayed. Daniel didn't go back to the tour. That decision didn't feel dramatic. There was no moment of declaration, no visible shift that anyone else would notice. He simply turned slightly away from the main cafeteria and remained near the edge of the hidden corner, as if he had chosen to linger without reason. But it was a decision, and somewhere, beneath the calm surface he had learned to maintain in every boardroom and negotiation, something had already begun to change. Annie finished the small piece of sandwich in her hand and wiped her fingers carefully on the napkin before folding it again with the same quiet precision. She didn't rush. She didn't fidget. She worked like someone who had learned that small actions mattered. Daniel watched her for another moment, then let his attention drift not away from her, but beyond her. He had spent years training himself to read rooms, not just what was said, but what was avoided, not just who spoke, but who stayed silent, not just what was visible, but what had been arranged to remain unnoticed. And now that he was looking for it, the cafeteria began to shift. Not physically, perceptually. A boy at a nearby table pushed his tray forward, leaving half his food untouched. His friend laughed, grabbed a cookie, and tossed the rest aside without thinking. A girl unwrapped a sandwich, took one bite, then set it down while she talked, distracted. Normal behavior, expected, but Daniel's eyes moved past them to the edges. A child near the far wall slipped something into his jacket pocket when a teacher turned away. Another girl hesitated before throwing away a carton of milk, glancing around as if calculating whether she could take it instead. And then, just as quickly, she dropped it into the trash. Decision made. Not worth the risk. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. It wasn't obvious. That was the problem. Nothing here was obvious unless you knew what to look for. He turned back toward Annie. She had closed her lunchbox now, her hands resting lightly on top of it. But her eyes had shifted. Not toward him, toward the opening. Someone was approaching. Daniel followed her gaze. A cafeteria aide moved past the divider, not entering the corner fully, but close enough to glance in. Her eyes swept the area quickly, professionally, the way people check spaces they don't expect to find anything in. For a fraction of a second, her gaze passed over Annie, then over Daniel. There was a pause, small, almost imperceptible. Then she looked away and continued walking. Nothing said, nothing acknowledged, but something had been seen. Annie's shoulders tightened again, just slightly. Daniel noticed. "You okay?" he asked quietly. She nodded, though her grip on the lunchbox firmed again. "She checks sometimes," Annie said under her breath. "Checks for what?" Annie shrugged. "Just to make sure." "Make sure of what?" Daniel didn't ask. He was beginning to understand that in places like this, questions didn't always have clear answers. Sometimes they had patterns instead, and patterns told their own story. He shifted his stance slightly, positioning himself just enough to break the direct line of sight from the cafeteria entrance without making it obvious. Not shielding her completely, just softening the angle. Annie noticed that too. She didn't say anything, but her shoulders eased again. A small adjustment, a quiet protection. Daniel let his gaze move once more, slower this time. The divider wasn't there by accident. It wasn't large enough to block the entire view, just enough to create a blind spot. A space that existed within the cafeteria but wasn't part of it. A space where things could happen quietly, where people could be placed or left. "Annie," he said after a moment, keeping his tone casual. "Who told you to sit here?" She hesitated. Her eyes dropped to her hands. "No one told me," she said, but the answer came too quickly. Daniel didn't challenge it. He simply nodded, as if accepting it. "Okay," he said. A few seconds passed. Then Annie added, softer, "It's just easier if I stay here." There it was again. Easier. Daniel leaned back slightly, folding his arms loosely, not closed off, just thinking. "For who?" he asked gently. Annie didn't answer, but she didn't need to, because at that moment, a group of students passed by the opening, laughter trailing behind them. One of the boys glanced toward the corner, his eyes landing briefly on Annie. He nudged his friend. A smirk, not loud enough to draw attention, not obvious enough to be called out, but clear enough. Daniel saw it. Annie saw it too. She looked down immediately, her fingers tracing the edge of the lunchbox as if it required her full attention. Invisible, on purpose. Daniel felt something shift again, sharper this time. Not anger, not yet, clarity. Because this wasn't just about rules, or food, or even poverty. This was about positioning, about where someone was allowed to exist within a space, and where they weren't. He straightened slightly, his eyes scanning the room once more, not as a visitor now, but as someone looking for structure, authority, Responsibility. Near the far side of the cafeteria, a teacher stood with a clipboard, watching the flow of students. Her posture was relaxed, practiced, the kind that came from years of managing controlled chaos. Daniel studied her for a moment. Then he looked back at Annie. "If you sat at one of those tables," he said quietly, nodding toward the main area, "what would happen?" Annie didn't answer right away. Her fingers stilled. "Then, they'd tell me to move." "Would they explain why?" She shook her head. "They don't have to." The simplicity of that answer landed heavier than anything else she had said. "They don't have to." Daniel exhaled slowly. In his world, everything required explanation, justification, documentation, accountability. Here, authority didn't explain itself. It enforced. He glanced again at the tables, at the empty seats, at the abundance that existed just a few steps away from where Annie sat on the floor. Then back at her, a 6-year-old who had already learned where she was allowed to be, and where she wasn't. Daniel Whitmore had built his life on systems, on understanding how they worked, how they failed, and how they could be reshaped. And standing here now, in a corner that wasn't meant to be seen, he recognized something familiar. Not the environment, not the people, but the structure. A system didn't need to announce itself to be real. It only needed to repeat. And this one was repeating quietly, every day, in a place where no one important was supposed to look. Daniel's gaze returned to Annie, steady now. "I'm going to ask a few questions," he said, his voice calm but firm in a way it hadn't been before. "Not about you, about the rules." Annie looked up at him, uncertainty flickering across her face. "Am I in trouble?" she asked. Daniel shook his head immediately. "No," he said. "You're the only one here who isn't." She didn't fully understand what he meant, but something in his tone settled her. And as the noise of the cafeteria carried on around them unchanged, uninterrupted, Daniel realized something else. The tour he had walked away from, that wasn't the real story. This was. Daniel moved carefully, not toward the center of the cafeteria, not toward the noise, the teachers, or the places designed to be seen. Instead, he stepped just far enough away from Annie to make his next action look ordinary, like a visitor stretching his legs, like a donor taking a closer look at operations. But his eyes stayed sharp. He approached the nearest staff member stationed by the cashier counter, a woman in her late 50s with silver-streaked hair pulled back neatly. Her posture was efficient, practiced someone who had worked in schools long enough to know when to speak and when to stay silent. "Excuse me," Daniel said politely. She looked up, her expression shifting instantly into a professional smile. "Yes, sir. Can I help you?" Daniel nodded slightly, keeping his tone calm, conversational. "I was just wondering," he said. "What's the policy on students taking uneaten food home?" The question was simple, but the reaction wasn't. The woman's smile didn't disappear, but it changed. Just a fraction. Tightened. Measured. "We don't allow that," she said. "Food is to be consumed in the cafeteria." "Across the board?" Daniel asked. "Yes, sir. It's for consistency." Consistency. Daniel let the word sit for a moment. "And if a student does take food," he continued. The woman hesitated not long, but long enough. "They're asked not to," she said. "It's explained to them." "Explained," Daniel repeated. Her eyes flicked briefly past him toward the corner, toward Annie, then back. "Yes, sir." Daniel followed that glance, just for a second, then returned his attention to her. "Do students get in trouble?" he asked. Another pause. "We try to handle things gently," she replied. "Try." Daniel gave a small, polite nod. "I appreciate that," he said. He didn't press further. Not because there wasn't more to ask, but because he had already heard enough. People didn't hesitate over policies they believed in. They didn't soften language unless there was something sharp underneath it. Daniel stepped away with a quiet thank you, leaving the woman to return to her routine. But his mind didn't return with him. It stayed on the details, on the hesitation, on the glance toward Annie, and most of all, on the word consistency. He turned back toward the corner. Annie was still there, exactly where he had left her. But something had changed. She was sitting even stiller now, her hands resting on top of her lunchbox, her posture carefully neutral, like someone trying not to draw attention by doing anything at all. She had been watching, not obviously, but enough. Daniel walked back slowly, stopping at the same distance as before. "I asked," he said quietly. Annie didn't look up. "I know," she murmured. "Of course she did." Children like her always knew when adults were talking about them, even when no names were spoken. Daniel lowered himself again, this time sitting more fully, both feet grounded, one arm resting loosely across his knee. They said it's a rule, he continued. Annie nodded faintly. I told you. Daniel studied her for a moment. You also said you didn't want to find out what happens if you break it. That made her fingers tighten slightly. I don't, she said. Her voice wasn't fearful. It was certain. Daniel leaned forward just a fraction. Annie, he said gently. Has anyone ever gotten in trouble for it? She hesitated. Her eyes flicked toward the cafeteria again, scanning quickly, instinctively, then back down. I saw a boy once, she said quietly. He tried to take a milk. Daniel waited. They made him put it back, she added. And then he didn't come back to the line. Did anyone explain why? She shook her head. They just said no. Daniel exhaled slowly. That word again. No. Not a reason. A boundary. He leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting once more across the cafeteria. This time, he wasn't looking at behavior. He was looking at structure, at how things were arranged. The flow of students, the placement of staff, the way certain areas were monitored more closely than others. And then he saw it. A binder, sitting on a small shelf beside the register, thick and labeled in black marker. It wasn't hidden, but it wasn't highlighted either. Just there. Daniel stood up again, this time with purpose disguised as curiosity. I'm going to take a look around, he said to Annie. Her head lifted slightly. Are you coming back? She asked. Daniel met her eyes. Yes. The answer was simple, but it mattered. She nodded once, as if accepting that, then looked back down at her hands. Daniel walked toward the register area again, slower this time, giving himself space to observe without drawing attention. No one stopped him. Visitors were expected to look. That was part of the design. He reached the shelf and let his gaze pass over it casually before settling on the binder. Routines, procedures, guidelines, words that always sounded harmless until you read what they allowed. He didn't touch it immediately. Instead, he glanced around. The staff were busy. Students moved in steady lines. No one was watching him closely enough to question a quiet moment of curiosity. Finally, he opened it. The pages inside were organized, neat, categorized. Names, columns, check marks. Daniel's eyes moved quickly, scanning, not reading every line, just enough to understand the pattern. Student ID, meal status, notes. One column caught his attention. Carry-out violation. He stilled. There were marks, not many, but enough to show it wasn't rare, enough to show it wasn't accidental. Daniel closed the binder slowly, carefully, as if it were something fragile or something dangerous. He stepped back, his expression unchanged, his movements controlled, but inside, something had shifted again, because now, this wasn't just a quiet corner, or a single child making a difficult choice. This was documented, tracked, normalized. A system. Daniel turned and walked back toward Annie. She looked up as he approached, her expression searching his face for something she couldn't quite name. He lowered himself once more, steady, calm, but different now. Annie, he said softly. She waited. Daniel held her gaze for a moment, then spoke with quiet certainty. You're not the only one. Annie didn't seem surprised. She just nodded. I know. And that, more than anything else, was what made it impossible for Daniel Whitmore to walk away. Daniel didn't speak right away. He stayed where he was, kneeling a few feet from Annie, letting the weight of what he had just seen settle into something clearer, something structured. Not outrage. Not yet. Just understanding. Because outrage without direction didn't change systems. And this was a system. Annie shifted slightly, her fingers tracing the edge of her lunchbox again. She wasn't looking at him now. She was watching the opening, the same way she had been since he arrived, like someone who had learned that safety wasn't permanent, only temporary. You said you knew, Daniel said quietly. About the other kids. Annie nodded, still not looking up. Sometimes they sit over there, she said, her voice low, careful. She tilted her head slightly toward the far wall, not the main tables, but another edge of the room where a few students sat apart, not quite isolated, but not included either. Daniel followed her gaze. 3 kids, different ages, sitting at the same table, but not together. Each one with their own tray. No conversation, No eye contact. Not punishment. Not officially, but not normal either. They don't stay long, Annie added. Why not? She shrugged. They don't like it. Daniel almost asked. Like what? But he already knew the answer. He leaned back slightly, resting his hand against the floor again, grounding himself in the moment. Annie, he said gently, has anyone ever told you why you can't take food home? She shook her head. They just say it's the rule. And that's enough? Another small shrug. They don't have to say more. There it was again. That quiet acceptance of incomplete answers. Daniel exhaled slowly through his nose. In his world, rules were negotiated, challenged, revised. People argued over them, built careers around bending them. Here, rules were absorbed, especially by children who had no power to question them. A sudden burst of laughter echoed from the cafeteria. A group of boys passed by the divider again, louder this time. One of them glanced toward the corner, saw Annie, and nudged his friend. No words, just a look, a shared understanding. Daniel's gaze followed them for a moment, then returned. Do they bother you? He asked. Annie shook her head quickly. No, too quickly. Daniel didn't press. Instead, he shifted the question. Do they sit here too? No. Why not? Annie hesitated. Then, almost inaudibly, they don't have to. The words landed with a quiet finality. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest again, not sharp, not explosive, but steady, building. He glanced once more toward the binder he had just closed in his mind, toward the columns and check marks that turned moments like this into data, and then back to Annie, a 6-year-old who had already mapped out her place in a system she didn't create. Hey, his voice softened again. Annie looked up. You're doing something kind, he said. Taking care of your mom like that. She blinked, uncertain. No one had framed it that way before. I'm just helping, she said. I know. A small silence followed. Then Annie asked, almost cautiously, Are you going to tell them? Daniel met her eyes. No. She studied him for a second longer, searching for something doubt, maybe, or confirmation. Then she nodded. Okay. Trust didn't arrive all at once, but something had shifted. Daniel stood again, slower this time, his movements deliberate but unhurried. He looked out across the cafeteria, letting his eyes trace the lines again. The flow, the structure, the invisible boundaries. And now he saw more. A teacher redirecting a student who lingered too long near the exit. A staff member watching who returned trays and who didn't. A quiet correction here. A subtle glance there. Nothing harsh, nothing obvious, but consistent. Always consistent. Daniel turned slightly, his voice lower now, more to himself than to Annie. Consistency, he murmured. Annie tilted her head. What? He shook his head lightly. Nothing. But it wasn't nothing. It was the word that held everything together. Consistency didn't mean fairness. It meant repetition. And repetition was how systems became invisible. Daniel walked a few steps toward the edge of the divider again, then stopped. He didn't rejoin the main space. Not yet. Instead, he watched. A student approached the trash can with a nearly full tray. Paused, looked around. For a second, Daniel thought, maybe he would do what Annie did. Save something. Take it. But then the boy dumped everything into the bin and walked away. Decision made. Conditioning stronger than need. Daniel's gaze dropped to the trash. Perfectly good food. Gone. Behind him, Annie shifted again. He turned back. She had reopened her lunchbox slightly, checking the folded napkin inside. Not adjusting it this time. Just confirming it was still there. Still safe. Still hers. Daniel stepped back toward her. Slower now. More grounded. Annie, he said quietly. She looked up. Does anyone ever give you extra food? He asked. She shook her head. No. Do you ever ask? Another quick shake. They say we should only take what we need. Daniel almost smiled at that. Almost. And what do you need? He asked. Annie hesitated. Her eyes dropped to the lunchbox again. Then, softly, less. That word stayed in the air between them. Less. Not because she needed less. Because she believed she should. Daniel felt it then, not anger, not frustration. Something deeper. A recognition that this wasn't just about hunger. It was about learning to take less. To be less. To need less. So no one would notice you needed anything at all. He crouched again, meeting her at eye level, You don't have to do this alone, he said. Annie frowned slightly. I'm not alone, she replied. I have my mom. Daniel nodded. I know. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. But sometimes, grown-ups need help too. Annie considered that, not rejecting it, just processing. Then she asked, in a voice that was almost curious, Are you going to help? Daniel held her gaze. This time, he didn't answer right away, because help, in his world, had always been simple. A check, a donation, a program. But this wasn't simple. This required something else, something slower, more precise. Finally, he said, Yes. Not loud, not dramatic, just certain. Annie nodded once, as if accepting that without needing more explanation. And Daniel Whitmore, standing in a corner that wasn't meant to exist, realized that whatever came next was no longer optional. Daniel didn't move immediately after he said it. Yes, the word had come out steady, controlled, but it carried more weight than Annie could possibly understand. And maybe more than he had intended, because helping, in this case, wasn't going to be simple. It wasn't going to be a quiet donation tucked into a foundation report or a line item buried under community outreach. It wasn't going to be solved by writing a check and trusting someone else to carry it forward. This required something else. Daniel straightened slowly, his eyes drifting once more across the cafeteria, but this time with sharper intent. He wasn't just observing anymore. He was mapping every movement, every glance, every unspoken rule that shaped what these children did and what they didn't dare to do. Behind him, Annie remained still, her lunchbox resting in her lap like something she had to protect, not just carry. Stay here for a minute, Daniel said gently. Annie looked up. I'm not leaving, he added, reading the question before she asked it. I just need to check something. She nodded, though her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the box. Daniel stepped away again. But this time, his pace was more deliberate. Not slow enough to draw attention, not fast enough to seem purposeful. Controlled, he moved along the edge of the cafeteria, staying just outside the main flow of students. His presence still blended in visitor badge, composed demeanor, the quiet authority of someone who belonged in places like this. That was the advantage. People didn't question him, and because of that, they didn't hide from him either. He approached a different staff member this time, a younger man overseeing the tray return station. The man was focused on his task, barely glancing up as students passed by. Busy day? Daniel asked casually. The man gave a quick nod. Always is around this time. Daniel smiled faintly. Looks like you've got a system down. That earned a small chuckle. Try to. Daniel let a beat pass, then gestured lightly toward the trays. I notice some kids don't finish their food, he said. What happens to the leftovers? The man shrugged. Goes in the trash. No sharing? No take-home option? The man hesitated. Not long, but enough. Not really, he said. We're not supposed to. Not supposed to, Daniel repeated. Health codes mostly, the man added quickly. And policy. There it was again. Policy. Daniel nodded, as if satisfied. Of course, he didn't press further, but his mind did, because now the language was consistent. Different people, same answers, same structure. He stepped away again, his gaze shifting this time toward the exit doors. A student approached, tray in hand, slowing slightly as he neared the threshold. For a moment, he hesitated just like the others had. Then a teacher's voice cut in, calm but firm. Tray stays here. The student nodded immediately, placing it down without argument. No resistance, no discussion, just compliance. Daniel watched that exchange closely. It wasn't enforcement through fear. It was enforcement through expectation, and expectation was harder to break. He turned back toward the corner. Annie was exactly where he had left her, but now she was watching him, not nervously, not anxiously, just attentively, as if she was trying to understand what he was doing, who he was. Daniel walked back and lowered himself again. The same distance, the same posture, predictable, steady. That seemed to matter to her. What did you check? Annie asked. Her voice was quiet, but curious now. Daniel rested his forearm lightly on his knee. I asked what happens to food people don't eat, he said. Annie's gaze dropped. They throw it away, she said. It wasn't a guess. It was something she had already learned. Daniel nodded. They do. A small silence followed. Then Annie asked, softer, did they say I can take it? Daniel looked at her. There it was. Hope. Careful. Measured. But there. He shook his head slightly. No. Annie nodded once. No disappointment. No surprise. Just confirmation. That's okay, she said. Daniel studied her for a moment. Is it? He asked. She hesitated. Then, it has to be. The answer was simple, but it carried something heavier than resignation. Acceptance. Daniel leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose. In his world, acceptance usually meant agreement. Here, it meant survival. He glanced again toward the trash can, toward the discarded trays, the untouched food, the quiet waste that no one questioned. Then back at Annie, a 6-year-old who had learned to measure what she deserved against what she was allowed to take. Annie, he said, his tone shifting still gentle, but firmer now, more grounded. What if there was a way to change the rule? She blinked. The question didn't land right away. Change it? She repeated. Daniel nodded. So you wouldn't have to hide it. Annie looked down at her lunchbox again, her fingers tracing the edge slowly. They don't change rules, she said. Not bitter, not sad, just certain. Daniel almost smiled again, not because it was funny, because it was accurate. They can, he said. They just don't always want to. Annie frowned slightly, thinking, why wouldn't they want to? She asked. Daniel paused. There were a lot of answers to that question, none of them simple. Sometimes, he said carefully, rules are easier than people. Annie didn't fully understand that, but she nodded anyway, as if accepting it for now. A moment passed. Then she asked, are you going to make them change it? Daniel held her gaze. This time, there was no hesitation. I'm going to try, he said. Annie considered that. Then, quietly, okay. She didn't ask how. She didn't ask when. Because in her world, those weren't questions that had reliable answers. But something had shifted. Not in the cafeteria. Not in the system. Not yet. But here, in this corner, between a man who had always operated at a distance and a child who had learned to live inside the consequences of that distance, Daniel Whitmore finally understood something he hadn't when he walked into the building. This wasn't just a problem to solve. It was a reality to confront. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't looking away. The cafeteria bell rang, not loud enough to startle, but sharp enough to shift the room. Students began to move in waves. Some stood up quickly, dumping half-eaten food without hesitation. Others lingered, finishing what they could before the next group arrived. The rhythm of the place changed, like a tide pulling back before coming in again. Daniel noticed how fast everything reset. Chairs straightened, tables wiped, trays stacked, order restored in minutes, as if nothing had happened, as if nothing ever did. He remained where he was, just outside the main flow, watching the transition. Systems revealed themselves best in motion, not when things were still, but when they reset. Behind him, Annie closed her lunchbox completely this time, pressing the lid down until it clicked softly. Her hand stayed there a second longer than necessary, as if confirming that everything inside was still exactly where she needed it to be. Safe. She stood up carefully, not abruptly, not drawing attention, just rising, like someone who had practiced leaving without being noticed. Daniel turned back toward her. Is it over? He asked. Annie nodded. This group, she said. Another one comes after. Of course. More students, more trays, more food, more rules. Daniel glanced at the clock on the far wall. The schedule was precise, timed, efficient, but Annie wasn't moving toward the exit like the others. She stayed near the corner, holding her lunchbox close to her side. Waiting. For what? Daniel asked gently. Annie looked toward the hallway. I wait until it's less crowded, she said. It's easier. Easier. That word again. Daniel followed her gaze. Students pushed through the double doors in clusters, loud and distracted. Teachers stood nearby, guiding the flow without really watching individuals, just managing the movement. It would have been easy to slip through. Easy for most kids, but not for her. Because she wasn't just carrying a lunchbox. She was carrying something she wasn't supposed to have. Daniel felt that realization settle deeper. Do you always leave last? He asked. Annie nodded. Most days. And no one asks why. She shook her head. They don't notice. The words were simple, but they carried something heavier than before. Not fear, not even sadness, just fact. Daniel looked at her for a moment longer. Then he made a quiet decision. "I'll walk with you," he said. Annie's head lifted slightly. "You don't have to," she replied quickly. "I know," Daniel said, "but I can." She hesitated, not rejecting the offer, just adjusting to it. Then she nodded once. "Okay." They didn't move right away. They waited. The crowd thinned gradually. The noise softened. The sharp edges of the cafeteria's energy dulled into something more manageable. Daniel watched the staff, still present, still attentive, but less focused now, less controlled. This was the gap, not a break in the system, just a moment where it wasn't looking as closely. Annie noticed it too. "Now," she said quietly. She stepped forward. Daniel followed at her pace, not ahead, not guiding, just beside her, matching her rhythm. They moved along the edge of the cafeteria, not cutting through the center, not drawing attention. Annie kept her eyes forward, her grip on the lunchbox steady but not tight enough to look suspicious. Practiced. This wasn't new for her. It was routine. Daniel felt that more than anything else. The absence of panic, the presence of method. They reached the tray return area. A staff member stood there, half focused on stacking trays, half watching the line. Annie slowed, just a fraction. Daniel saw it. That tiny hesitation before the threshold, the moment where decision met risk. He stepped slightly closer, not touching, not obvious, just enough to occupy space beside her. A subtle shift, but enough. They moved forward together. The staff member glanced up. Her eyes passed over Daniel, first the badge, the posture, the quiet authority of someone who belonged. Then Annie, a shorter glance, less attention, no questions, no pause. "Have a good afternoon," the woman said automatically. Daniel nodded. "You too." And just like that, they were through, out of the cafeteria, into the hallway. The air felt different immediately, quieter, wider, less contained. Annie kept walking for a few more steps before stopping. She looked down at her lunchbox, then back at the doors behind them, as if confirming something. Daniel watched her. "You made it out," he said softly. Annie nodded. "I always do." But there was something different in her voice this time. Not relief, recognition. She looked up at him. "You helped," she said. Daniel considered that. He hadn't done much, not visibly, but he understood what she meant. "I just walked with you," he replied. Annie shook her head slightly. "No," she said. "They look at you first." The statement was simple, but it carried a clarity that Daniel couldn't ignore. Visibility, priority, who gets seen first, who gets questioned, who gets overlooked. He exhaled slowly. For Annie, that wasn't theory. It was experience. They stood there for a moment, the hallway stretching out in both directions. Students moved past them, lockers opening and closing, conversations rising and falling in fragments. Normal. Everything looked normal again. But Daniel knew better now. "Where do you go next?" he asked. "Class," Annie said. She adjusted her grip on the lunchbox. Then, after a small pause, "I'd take the long way." Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly. "Why?" She glanced down the hall. "Less people," she said. Of course, less people meant less attention. Less attention meant less risk. Daniel nodded slowly. "Mind if I walk with you a little longer?" he asked. Annie hesitated, then looked up at him again. "You don't have to," she repeated. "I know," Daniel said. A small silence. Then she gave a quiet, "Okay." They started walking. This time, the hallway felt different, not because it had changed, but because Daniel had. Each step revealed more than it had before, not in what was visible, but in what had always been there, waiting for someone to notice. And for the first time, he wasn't just passing through, he was paying attention. They didn't take the main hallway. Daniel noticed it immediately. As they moved away from the cafeteria, Annie slowed near an intersection where most students turned right toward a wider corridor lined with lockers, bright posters, and teachers standing at their doors, greeting the flow of children with practiced warmth. Instead, Annie turned left. The difference was subtle at first, then obvious. The hallway narrowed, the lighting dimmed slightly, the noise faded behind them, replaced by quieter sounds, the hum of fluorescent lights, the distant echo of footsteps. the soft click of a classroom door closing somewhere far ahead. Daniel adjusted his pace to match hers. "You weren't kidding about the long way," he said gently. Annie shook her head. "It's faster," she replied. Daniel glanced down the empty stretch ahead. "It doesn't look faster." Annie didn't smile. "Less people," she said again, and that was her definition of fast. Daniel nodded, absorbing it. They walked side by side, not touching, not speaking for a few steps. The quiet here wasn't uncomfortable, it was different. Not forced, not controlled. Just unobserved. For the first time since he had entered the building, Daniel felt like he was seeing the school without its performance. No smiling banners, no curated greetings, just the space as it functioned when no one important was looking. He glanced at the walls. Fewer posters here, older ones, edges curling slightly, a bulletin board with outdated announcements. This wasn't where the school told its story. This was where it forgot to. "Do teachers come through here?" Daniel asked. "Sometimes," Annie said. "Not a lot." "Why?" She shrugged. "They don't need to." There it was again. Need. Everything in her world seemed to revolve around that word. Daniel slowed slightly, his eyes scanning the hallway more carefully now, not for danger, but for absence. Absence of supervision. Absence of attention. Absence of expectation. It wasn't neglect. It was design. Intentional or not, this was a space where things didn't get questioned, which made it useful. Annie's footsteps were light, almost soundless against the tile. She held her lunchbox close, but not as tightly as before. The tension in her shoulders had eased since they left the cafeteria. Not gone, but less. Daniel noticed that too. "You feel better out here," he said. It wasn't a question. Annie glanced up at him, surprised. "A little," she admitted. "Why?" She thought about it. Then, "No one's watching." Daniel let out a slow breath. That sentence stayed with him. No one's watching. In most environments, that meant freedom. Here, it meant safety. They reached a corner where the hallway turned again. Annie slowed, peeking around it before stepping forward. Daniel watched that carefully. Not fear. Procedure. She had learned how to miss spaces like this. Not just physically, strategically. "Do you do that a lot?" he asked. "Do what?" "Check corners." Annie looked at him like the question was obvious. "Yeah." Daniel nodded once. Smart. She didn't react to the compliment. To her, it wasn't something to be proud of. It was just necessary. They continued walking. A classroom door opened ahead, and a teacher stepped out, holding a stack of papers. She glanced up as they approached. Her eyes landed on Daniel first, paused. Visitor badge. Sweet. Posture. Recognition without context. Then Annie. A quicker glance. Less weight. "Good afternoon," the teacher said. Daniel nodded politely. "Good afternoon." Annie said nothing, just kept walking, her gaze forward. The teacher watched them for a second longer than necessary, then turned back into the classroom. Daniel felt that moment linger. Not suspicion, not concern. Just a calculation that didn't quite resolve. He looked down at Annie. "You didn't say hi," he said gently. Annie shrugged. "She didn't say it to me." Daniel almost responded, then stopped, because she was right. The greeting hadn't been for her. It had been for him, and Annie had already learned the difference. They walked a few more steps in silence. Then, Annie spoke again, quieter this time. "You don't belong here." Daniel glanced at her. "That obvious?" She nodded. "You walk different." Daniel let out a soft breath, something close to a laugh, but not quite. "How do I walk?" "Like you're not worried," she said. The answer came quickly, without hesitation. Daniel didn't respond right away, because that was the difference. Not money, not status, not even opportunity, just that one thing, the absence of constant awareness. "I guess I'm not," he said. Annie looked down at her lunchbox again. "I am," she said. The honesty in her voice wasn't heavy. It was simple, stated, accepted. Daniel felt it settle somewhere deeper this time, not as information, as responsibility. They reached another intersection, this one leading back toward the main academic wing. The noise picked up again, slightly voices, lockers, movement. Annie slowed. "This is where I go," she said. Daniel nodded. "Your classroom?" She pointed down the hall. "Second door." He followed her gesture, then looked back at her. "Do you want me to walk you there?" Annie hesitated, not out of fear, out of thought. Then she shook her head. No. A small pause. I can go. Daniel studied her for a moment, then nodded. Okay. She adjusted her grip on the lunchbox, holding it steady at her side. Then she took a step forward, stopped, turned back. Are you coming back? She asked. Daniel met her eyes. Yes. The answer came without hesitation. Annie nodded once, not smiling, but something in her expression had changed. Not trust, not fully, but recognition. Then she turned and walked down the hallway. Her steps light, steady, practiced. Daniel watched her go, all the way to the second door. Watched her pause, glance once down the hallway, checking, always checking, then slip inside. The door closed behind her, and just like that, she disappeared into the system again. Daniel stood there for a moment longer. The hallway moved around him. Students passed. Voices echoed. A bell rang somewhere in the distance. Everything continued. Normal, uninterrupted. But Daniel Whitmore wasn't the same man who had walked into that building an hour ago, because now he understood something he hadn't before. This wasn't just about hunger. It wasn't even just about rules. It was about what children learn to become. In order to survive those rules, and Annie, a 6-year-old girl with a folded sandwich in her lunchbox, had already learned far too much. Daniel turned slowly, his gaze shifting back toward the direction of the cafeteria, back toward the corner, back toward the system that had taught her all of it. And this time, he wasn't observing anymore. He was preparing. Daniel didn't go back to the cafeteria immediately. He stood there for a moment after Annie disappeared into her classroom, letting the hallway settle into its usual rhythm again. Lockers slammed. Voices rose and fell. A teacher called out a reminder about homework. Everything felt ordinary. That was the problem, because now he knew what ordinary was built on. He turned slowly and began walking back, not toward the main corridor this time, but along the same quieter path Annie had taken. The long way. It wasn't just about distance anymore. It was about perspective. Each step felt different now. Not heavier, but more deliberate. The building hadn't changed, but his awareness of it had. The absence of eyes in certain hallways. The presence of control in others. The quiet choreography that guided where students moved, where they stopped, where they didn't belong. Daniel Whitmore had spent his life understanding systems that were designed on paper. This one was designed through behavior. He reached the intersection where Annie had first turned, then continued forward, re-entering the edge of the cafeteria space just as the next wave of students began to arrive. New faces, new trays, same routine. The room filled quickly again, energy rising in layers, laughter, movement, voices overlapping. The earlier group was gone, erased from the scene as if they had never been there. Reset. Daniel stayed near the back, partially shielded by the divider, observing without interrupting. And now that he knew what to look for, he saw it immediately. A boy hesitating at the milk station, a girl glancing twice before taking a second apple, then putting it back. A staff member watching not closely, but consistently. Patterns, not isolated. Repeated. Daniel's eyes moved toward the corner. The same space, the same chairs, the same trash can. Empty now, but not unused. A few minutes passed, and then, another child, smaller than the others. He approached the edge of the divider, tray in hand, scanning the room the same way Annie had. Not identical, but similar. Learned behavior. The boy stepped toward the corner, stopped, looked back, then turned away and walked toward a table instead. Decision made. Not safe enough. Daniel felt something settle deeper inside him. This wasn't just about the kids who sat there. It was about the ones who didn't. The ones who calculated the risk and chose differently. The ones who adapted before they were forced to. He shifted his position slightly, stepping out just enough to be visible but not central. A presence, not a disruption. The cafeteria aide from earlier moved past him again. This time, she slowed slightly. "Sir," she said politely, "did you find everything you needed?" Daniel gave a small nod. "I'm getting there." Her smile was professional. "Well, if you have any questions, the principal would be happy to help." Of course he would. Daniel held her gaze for a moment, not confrontational, just steady. "I'm sure he would," he said. She hesitated, just for a second, then nodded and continued on. Daniel watched her go. People here were trained to redirect, to guide attention back to approved spaces, back to the version of the school that was meant to be seen. But he wasn't interested in that version anymore. He turned slightly, scanning again. Near the serving line, a girl picked up her tray, moved to a table. Then, after a moment, quietly slipped half her sandwich into her backpack. Not hidden well, not carefully, just quickly. A risk. Daniel watched what happened next. Nothing. No one stopped her. No one noticed. Or, no one chose to notice. That was different. Because systems didn't just operate on rules. They operated on enforcement, selective enforcement, and selective attention. Daniel exhaled slowly. Then he moved, not toward the girl, not toward the staff, but back toward the register area. The binder was still there. Same place, same position. He didn't open it this time. He didn't need to. He already knew what it represented. Instead, he turned slightly, addressing another staff member nearby, a woman organizing trays. "Can I ask you something?" he said. She looked up. "Of course." Daniel gestured lightly toward the room. "How do you decide which rules to enforce strictly and which ones to let go?" The question was simple, but it landed differently. The woman blinked, caught off guard. "We enforce all of them," she said. Daniel nodded slightly. "Of course," he replied. Then, after a small pause, but not always the same way, she hesitated. Her hands stilled for just a second on the tray she was holding. Then she gave a careful answer. "We try to use judgment." Judgment. Daniel let that word sit. "Based on what?" he asked. The woman's eyes flicked around the room, then back to him. "Context," she said. Daniel almost smiled. "Context. Another clean word. Another flexible one." He nodded politely. "I appreciate that." He stepped away before she could say more, because he wasn't looking for answers anymore. He was confirming them, and now they were consistent. He moved back toward the divider again, standing where he could see both the main cafeteria and the corner at the same time. Two spaces, one system, different rules, or at least different applications of them. A group of students passed by, louder than the others. One of them glanced at Daniel, noticing the badge, the posture, recognition, but not understanding. They moved on. Daniel remained, still, watching, because now he knew something the room didn't. This wasn't about fixing a small problem. It wasn't about adjusting a rule or making an exception. It was about exposing a pattern. And patterns, once seen clearly, were hard to hide again. Daniel Whitmore stood in the space between what was shown and what was hidden. And for the first time since he arrived, his role had fully changed. He wasn't a visitor anymore. He wasn't even a donor. He was a witness. And the moment a system gains a witness, it starts to become accountable. Daniel didn't leave the cafeteria right away. He could have. He had already seen enough to justify concern, enough to raise questions, enough to make a quiet note and follow up later through the proper channels. That was how things usually worked in his world: observe, verify, escalate, clean, controlled. But something about this didn't feel like it would survive delay, because delay gave systems time to adjust, time to reframe, time to make what he had seen disappear into language that sounded reasonable on paper. So instead of leaving, Daniel stepped out of the corner and into the main space. Not abruptly, not in a way that demanded attention, just enough to shift from observer to participant. The difference was immediate. Noise hit him first, full, layered, constant. Students moving in lines, trays sliding across counters, voices overlapping in uneven rhythm. The kind of environment where individual moments dissolved quickly into the whole. That was the design. Daniel walked slowly along the edge of the serving line, his gaze steady, his posture relaxed but intentional. A few students glanced at him, noticing the badge, the unfamiliar presence, but none stopped. They weren't supposed to. He reached the front where meals were being distributed. A staff member handed a tray to a student without looking up, repeating the same phrase she had likely said hundreds of times that day. Next, Daniel stepped slightly aside, letting the flow continue, then turned toward the counter where an older woman stood organizing utensils. "Excuse me," he said. She looked up, her expression polite but guarded. "Yes?" Daniel gestured lightly toward the trays. "How many meals do you serve in a day?" he asked. The question was neutral. "Safe. Depends on the day," she replied. "A few hundred." Daniel nodded. "And what happens to what's left over?" She paused, just slightly. "Most of it gets discarded," she said. "Most of it," Daniel repeated. She shifted her weight. "We follow guidelines," she added. Guidelines. Another word that carried structure without explanation. Daniel gave a small nod, then asked, "Is there ever a situation where a student is allowed to take food home?" The woman's eyes flicked toward the back of the cafeteria, toward the corner, then back to him. "No," she said, firm this time, not hesitant. "No exceptions?" She hesitated again. Then, "Not officially." Daniel caught that. Not officially. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he let the silence sit just long enough for the words to settle between them. "Unofficially?" he asked, his voice still calm. The woman's expression tightened slightly. "We try to be fair," she said. "Fair?" Daniel exhaled slowly. "Fair to who?" he asked. The question wasn't sharp, but it landed that way anyway. The woman didn't answer immediately. Her hands moved again, adjusting utensils that didn't need adjusting. "To everyone," she said finally. Daniel nodded once. "Of course." He stepped back, not pressing further, because again, he didn't need more answers. He needed clarity, and he was getting it. He turned, scanning the room once more, and that was when he saw it. Near the far end of the cafeteria, partially obscured by a group of students, a small interaction, quiet, almost invisible. A boy, maybe 8, holding his tray a little too tightly, a staff member leaning down, speaking to him in a low voice. Daniel moved slightly closer, not enough to intrude, just enough to hear fragments. "You know the rule. Can't take that. Put it back." The boy hesitated, looked down at his tray, then slowly, reluctantly, placed something back onto it. A piece of fruit, an apple. He didn't argue. He didn't ask why. He just complied. Daniel watched as the staff member gave a small nod, satisfied, and moved on. The boy stood there for a second longer, then walked toward a table. Alone. Daniel felt it then, not as a sudden emotion but as something settling into place. A pattern confirmed. This wasn't about isolated decisions. This wasn't about individual judgment. This was consistent, enforced when seen, ignored when not, and understood by the children without needing explanation. Daniel turned away slowly. His gaze drifted toward the entrance of the cafeteria, and there, standing just inside the doorway, was Principal Harris. He hadn't been there before, or maybe he had. Watching, waiting, either way. His timing wasn't accidental. He approached with a smooth, practiced smile, the kind that never quite reached the eyes. "Mr. Whitmore," he said warmly, "I was told you stepped away from the tour." Daniel met his gaze evenly. "I did. I hope everything is all right," Harris continued. "We try to make sure our guests have a clear understanding of our programs." "Programs?" Daniel nodded slightly. "I'm starting to," he said. Harris's smile held, but something behind it shifted. "Perhaps we should continue the tour," he suggested. "There are many things we'd love to show you." "Show you?" Daniel glanced briefly around the cafeteria, at the noise, at the movement, at the systems operating in plain sight, then back at Harris. "I think I've seen what I need to see for now," he said. The words were calm, measured, but they carried weight. Harris's expression didn't break. Men like him didn't let it. "Of course," he replied. "But context is important. What you're seeing here, it can sometimes be misunderstood." "Misunderstood." Daniel almost smiled. "I agree," he said. "Context matters." A small silence stretched between them. Not long, but enough. Harris adjusted his stance slightly. "If you have concerns," he said, lowering his voice just a fraction, "we'd be happy to address them through the proper channels." "Proper channels." Daniel held his gaze. "I'm sure you would," he said, and in that moment, both men understood something without saying it. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a difference in perspective, one built on presentation, the other on what had been quietly hidden behind it. Daniel glanced once more toward the back of the cafeteria, toward the corner, empty now, but no less real. Then he looked back at Harris. "I'll be in touch," he said. Harris nodded. "Of course." Daniel turned and walked toward the exit, not rushed, not dramatic, just certain. And as he stepped out of the cafeteria, back into the hallway where everything looked normal again, he understood exactly what came next. This wasn't something he would confront in the moment, not loudly, not publicly, because systems like this didn't break under pressure. They adapted, they redirected, they survived. No, this required something else, something quieter, more precise, Daniel Whitmore had spent his life learning how to dismantle structures that looked untouchable from the outside, and now he had found one worth dismantling. Daniel didn't go home right away. He sat in his car for a long moment, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, the engine still off. The school building stood across the parking lot, calm and ordinary in the late afternoon light. Parents moved in and out. A bus idled near the curb. Somewhere, a child laughed. From the outside, nothing was wrong. That was the first problem. Daniel leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose. He had seen this before, not in schools. Not like this, but in systems that relied on appearance. The kind that polished the surface so well that anyone who questioned it looked unreasonable. He closed his eyes for a second, and Annie's voice came back. I eat enough. I don't need all of it. Simple, careful. Wrong. Daniel opened his eyes again. Then he reached for his phone. He didn't scroll. Didn't hesitate. He dialed. The line rang once, twice. Then a voice answered, calm, alert. Daniel. Rachel, he said. I need you. There was no small talk. There never was between them. Rachel Klein had worked with him for nearly a decade. Legal strategist. Compliance specialist. The kind of mind that didn't react to emotion, but translated it into action. What kind of problem? She asked. Daniel looked back at the school. The kind that looks clean on paper, he said, and wrong in person. A brief pause. Go on. Daniel spoke slowly, not because he was unsure, but because he was precise. He described the cafeteria, the rule, the enforcement, the inconsistency, the children. He didn't dramatize. He didn't need to. Rachel didn't interrupt. When he finished, there was a short silence on the line. Then, is it written policy? She asked. I saw documentation, Daniel said. But I didn't take anything. Good, Rachel replied. That means they don't know what you know yet. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. They know I asked questions. That's not the same thing, she said. Questions are deniable. Evidence isn't. Daniel nodded, even though she couldn't see it. What's the risk? He asked. Rachel didn't hesitate. They'll reframe it, she said. Health codes, fairness, resource control. They'll say it's about structure, not restriction. Daniel let out a quiet breath. That's exactly what they said. Of course it is, Rachel replied. That's the language systems use when they don't want to say what they're actually doing. Daniel looked down at his hands. And what are they actually doing? He asked. Rachel's answer came clean. They're controlling behavior through limitation, she said, and teaching compliance early. Daniel's grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly. And the kids? A pause. Adapt, she said, or get corrected until they do. Daniel looked back at the school again, at the doors, at the windows, at the place where Annie had walked back inside without questioning it. I'm not interested in correcting the kids, he said. I know, Rachel replied. So we don't touch the kids. Daniel frowned slightly. What do we touch? The system, she said, quietly. Daniel leaned back again. Walk me through it. Rachel's tone shifted more structured now. First, she said, we document. Not what you think you saw, what we can prove. Daniel nodded. Second, we identify scope. Is this school-specific or district-wide? It felt consistent, Daniel said. Not improvised. Then assume it's broader, Rachel replied. Which means more exposure but also more resistance. Daniel let that settle. And third, Rachel paused. Third, she said, we protect the people they can pressure. Daniel knew exactly who she meant. Annie, her mother, anyone without leverage. They haven't pushed yet, he said. They will, Rachel replied. If they think this becomes a problem. Daniel's expression hardened slightly. Then we move before they do. Exactly. A small silence followed. Then Rachel added, Daniel, this isn't going to be fast. I know. It's not going to be clean either. Daniel looked down again, then back up. I don't need it to be clean, he said. I need it to be right. Another pause. Then quieter. Good, Rachel said. Because those are rarely the same thing. Daniel almost smiled. Almost. What do you need from me? He asked. Access, she said. Names. Entry points. Anything that lets us pull records without triggering alarms. Daniel thought for a second. The principal, he said. He already tried to redirect me. Of course he did. And there's a binder, Daniel added. Tracking violations. Rachel didn't react emotionally, but her voice sharpened. That's not just a rule, she said. That's enforcement history. Daniel nodded. That's what I thought. Good, she said. Then we start there. Daniel glanced at the time. School would be out soon. Students leaving. Annie walking out with that lunchbox, carrying what she thought she had to hide. I'm going back tomorrow, he said. Rachel didn't object. Then don't go as a donor, she said. Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly. How do I go? As a question they can't answer easily. Daniel considered that, then nodded. All right. Rachel paused, then added one more thing. Daniel. Yeah. Don't confront them yet. He looked back at the school. I wasn't planning to. Good, she said. Because once you do, they stop being honest. Daniel exhaled slowly. They already are. Rachel didn't disagree. No, she said. They're just not careful yet. The call ended shortly after that. Daniel sat there for another moment, the phone still in his hand. Then he placed it down, started the engine, but he didn't drive right away. Instead, he looked at the school one last time, at the windows reflecting the afternoon light, at the place where everything looked exactly the way it was supposed to. And he thought, systems don't fear questions. They fear answers that can't be ignored. Daniel Whitmore shifted the car into gear, and for the first time since he walked into that building, he wasn't just preparing to understand the system. He was preparing to expose it. Daniel returned the next morning without announcement. No entourage, no scheduled tour, no polished introduction waiting at the front desk. He walked in the same way any other adult might checked in, accepted the temporary badge, and moved through the hallway with quiet purpose. But there was a difference now. Yesterday, he had been looking. Today, he was verifying. The building greeted him the same way it greeted everyone else: clean floors, bright walls, carefully arranged student work that told a story of effort and pride. A teacher nodded as he passed. A student held the door open. Everything still worked. That was what made it dangerous. Daniel didn't go to the office. He didn't look for the principal. He went straight back to the cafeteria. Lunch hadn't started yet. That mattered. The room was quieter, half prepared. Staff moved between stations, setting up trays, stacking cartons, organizing utensils. The system before activation. This was where structure lived most clearly. He stepped inside, slower this time, letting no one feel rushed by his presence. The older woman from the day before noticed him first. Her eyes flicked to his badge, then to his face. Recognition, not comfort. You're back, she said. Daniel gave a small nod. I had a few more questions. Her expression remained neutral, but her hands paused briefly over the stack of trays. Before the students come in, she asked. Daniel met her gaze. Before everything gets busy, that was answer enough. She didn't invite him closer, but she didn't stop him either. Daniel moved toward the register area again. The binder was still there, exactly where it had been. That told him something important. No one had moved it. No one had hidden it, which meant either they didn't think it mattered, or they didn't think anyone would look twice. Daniel reached for it this time. Not quickly, not secretly, just openly. He flipped it open. The pages were the same. Neat columns, clean handwriting, names, dates, notes. He turned one page, then another. Patterns began to sharpen. Not just frequency, consistency. Certain students appearing more than once. Certain notes repeating. Attempted to remove food. Reminded of policy. Non-compliant behavior. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. Non-compliant. The word felt wrong in this context. Too formal, too distant, as if it described a disruption. Instead of a child making a choice, he turned another page, then stopped. A name. Small. Familiar. Annie. He didn't react outwardly, didn't pause long enough for anyone to notice, but his eyes stayed on the line. Single entry. Short note. Observed holding food beyond assigned portion. Assigned portion. Daniel closed the binder slowly, carefully, the same way he had the day before. But this time, he understood more. This wasn't random enforcement. It was recorded, defined, justified. He stepped back, and that was when he heard it. Mr. Whitmore. Daniel turned. Principal Harris stood a few steps away, closer than yesterday. No smile this time. Just control. I didn't expect you back so soon, Harris said. Daniel nodded once. I had some time. Harris's eyes flicked briefly to the binder. Then back to Daniel. I see you're reviewing internal materials, he said. Not a question. Daniel didn't deny it. I'm trying to understand your process, he replied. Harris took a step closer, measured. This isn't part of the public tour, he said. Daniel held his gaze. I figured. A small silence stretched between them. Then Harris's tone shifted, still calm, but firmer. If you have concerns, we'd prefer you bring them to administration, he said. Not draw conclusions from incomplete information. Incomplete. Daniel almost smiled. Then complete it for me, he said. Harris's expression tightened slightly. This is a school, Mr. Whitmore, he replied. We have to maintain structure, order, fairness. There it was again. The language. Daniel nodded slowly. Fairness, he repeated. Yes. Daniel glanced briefly around the cafeteria. Empty tables, prepared trays, a system waiting to begin. Then back at Harris. Is it fair, Daniel asked quietly, that a child has to hide food to take it home? Harris didn't answer immediately. Instead, he adjusted his stance. That's a mischaracterization, he said. Is it? Daniel asked. Harris's voice remained even. Students are provided meals here, he said. Our responsibility is to ensure those resources are used appropriately. Appropriately. Daniel let that word settle. And when they're not? He asked. We intervene, Harris said. By documenting them? Daniel asked. Harris's eyes flicked to the binder again. By guiding behavior, he corrected. Guiding. Daniel nodded. Toward what? He asked. This time, Harris paused. Longer. Toward compliance, he said. There it was. Finally said out loud. Daniel exhaled slowly. Not frustrated, not surprised. Just certain. He looked at Harris steadily. They're 6 years old, he said. Harris didn't flinch. They're students, he replied. The distinction was subtle, but it mattered. Daniel stepped back slightly, creating space, not retreating, reframing. Yesterday, he said, a child asked me not to stand near her. Harris said nothing. She wasn't afraid of me, Daniel continued. She was afraid of being seen. A small silence. Then Harris spoke, quieter now. Children misunderstand rules, he said. Daniel shook his head once. No, he said. They learn them. The words landed, not loud, but final. For a moment, neither man moved. The cafeteria behind them began to shift, staff preparing. Doors opening. The first signs of the next lunch period beginning to form. The system starting again. Harris straightened slightly. If you're planning to escalate this, he said, I'd advise caution. Daniel met his gaze. That sounds like a warning. It's a recommendation, Harris replied. Daniel nodded. Then I'll consider it. Harris held his gaze for a second longer, then turned and walked away. No resolution, no agreement, just distance. Daniel stood there, the noise of the room beginning to rise again as students started to enter. The same patterns, the same structure, the same invisible lines. He looked once more at the binder, at the pages that turned behavior into record, at the system that turned need into violation. And then, he stepped away, not because he was finished, but because he wasn't. As the cafeteria filled again, Daniel Whitmore walked out into the hallway with something he hadn't had yesterday. Not just understanding, not just concern, but confirmation, and confirmation was the beginning of consequence. This story reminds us that injustice does not always appear loud or obvious sometimes. It hides behind rules that seem fair on the surface. A child should never have to choose between feeding herself and caring for her parent. Yet Annie learned to do so in silence. The real lesson is that kindness and awareness matter more than blind obedience to systems. When people stop looking away and begin asking the right questions, even the most normalized unfairness can be exposed. True justice begins not with power, but with the courage to see what others ignore and to act on it. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.